The morning Thomas Whitmore found his 7-year-old son crying behind the barn, something inside him cracked wide open. The boy's shoulders shook. His face was buried in his hands. And standing beside him, kneeling in the dust with her hand on his back, was the woman he'd hired 3 months ago to clean his house. The housekeeper he barely knew. The woman whose name he could never quite remember, so he'd stopped trying. Thomas stood frozen in the barn doorway, watching this moment, not quite understanding what he was seeing. His son Daniel had not spoken in 4 years. Not since the fever. Not since the doctors came and went and finally stopped coming. Not since Thomas's wife, Margaret, took her last breath in the room upstairs, and Thomas realized that grief could be heavy enough to crush a man's bones from the inside out. Daniel had been born with perfect hearing. The boy could follow whispers across a field. He could hear a hawk's cry from a mile away. But his mother's voice, soft and certain, reading to him at night in that room with the blue wallpaper, that voice he would never hear again. So Daniel had stopped listening. He had stopped speaking. He had stopped everything except breathing and moving through the days like a ghost that didn't know it was haunting its own life. Thomas had accepted this, or he thought he had. He'd learned to talk to his son in short, efficient sentences about chores and meals and bedtime. He'd learned not to expect answers. He'd learned to raise a boy who existed in silence, who moved through the world without making a mark on it, who would grow up in the shadows of his own home. That was the life Thomas had resigned himself to until the morning he saw the housekeeper kneeling in the dust beside his son, whispering something to him, and Daniel's face turned up toward her with a look of such desperate concentration that Thomas felt his chest tighten. The housekeeper's name was Ruth. Thomas remembered this only because he'd heard the doctor call her by it when she'd come to help after Margaret died. Ruth had shown up at the house in early spring with a single bag containing everything she owned. She was plain. She was efficient. She asked no questions and caused no trouble. She cleaned the kitchen and the parlor and the bedrooms without any fuss. She prepared meals that were adequate if not remarkable. She moved through the house like she was trying not to take up space, like her presence was something to apologize for. Thomas paid her twice a month and didn't think about her much beyond that. But now, watching her with Daniel, something shifted in the way he saw her. Ruth was pointing at something in the dust. She'd drawn marks there, marks that looked almost like shapes. Daniel was leaning forward, studying them with an intensity he hadn't shown in anything since his mother died. Ruth's lips were moving. Thomas couldn't hear what she was saying from where he stood, but he could see the concentration on her face. The careful way she was forming words, the patience in her shoulders. She drew another mark in the dust, then another. She pointed to the first mark and said something. Daniel's eyes grew wider. Ruth said something else and Daniel's body went absolutely still. His small hand rose slowly. It was shaking. His finger touched the mark Ruth had drawn. Ruth's face broke into a smile so genuine, so real, that it was like watching sunlight break through clouds that had been blocking the sky for years. Thomas found himself moving forward without deciding to. His boots crunched on the straw. Ruth and Daniel both turned, startled. Ruth scrambled to her feet so quickly she lost her balance. Dust fell from her dress. Her face flushed a deep red that climbed from her neck to her hairline. She looked terrified. Thomas opened his mouth, but he didn't know what words were supposed to come out. He looked at his son. Daniel's eyes had gone distant again. The moment was closing. Whatever door had opened was shutting itself against Thomas and his presence and his authority as the father of this child. Ruth started, her voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her palms on her apron. Daniel was, she swallowed hard. I'm sorry, sir, I shouldn't be. Thomas held up his hand. His voice came out rough. What were you teaching him? Ruth's eyes widened. She looked at Daniel, then back at Thomas. He couldn't read her face. It was like watching someone decide whether to trust you with something precious. Letters, she said finally. I was showing him letters. His mother wanted to teach him to read before she got sick. She started, but then, well. Ruth didn't finish. She didn't need to. They both knew what had happened. They both knew that Margaret's lessons had stopped along with her heartbeat. Thomas looked at Daniel. His son was watching Ruth again, not Thomas, always not Thomas. "How did you know?" Thomas said. "How did you know he wanted that?" Ruth's hands twisted in her apron. "When you lose someone," she said carefully, like she was walking through a dark room and feeling for walls, "you start to understand what they left behind, what they wanted to leave behind." She paused. "I have a little brother. He never learned to read. He died when he was young, before he could." Ruth's eyes were fixed on some point beyond the barn wall, looking at something Thomas couldn't see. "I swore I would teach the next child I met, if I got the chance." Daniel was watching her now with that same intensity, as if he understood, as if he knew she was telling him something important about how the world works, about how people carry their losses forward. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for 4 years beginning to thaw in a way that was both painful and necessary. He looked at Ruth more carefully than he ever had before. She was still young, maybe 30 at most, though her face had the kind of weariness that came from carrying grief. Her dress was mended in several places. Her hands were rough from work. Her hair was plain brown, pulled back in a simple knot. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing that would catch a man's eye in a crowd. And yet there was something in the way she was looking at Daniel, something so full of tenderness that it made Thomas understand for the first time why his son had turned to her instead of to him. Why Daniel would risk opening his mouth to this stranger when he wouldn't risk it for his own father. "Go on," Thomas said. He didn't recognize his own voice. It sounded far away. "Keep teaching him." Ruth's eyes snapped to his face. She looked shocked. "Sir," she said, "I don't know if that's appropriate. I mean, he's your son, and you might have other plans, and I was overstepping, and I'm sorry." She was talking quickly, nervously, her fingers still twisting in her apron. Thomas held up his hand again. "I don't have other plans. I don't know how to teach him. I don't know how to reach him, but you do." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "If you're sure, sir, I'm sure." He looked at Daniel. His son was watching Ruth again. His small face was hopeful in a way that Thomas hadn't seen it in years. "Yes," Thomas said, "I'm sure." Over the next weeks, Thomas noticed changes in his house. Small things at first. Ruth would leave drawings on the kitchen table, single letters made with charcoal on scrap paper. Daniel would sit for hours studying them. Ruth would whisper sounds, just the sound of the letter by itself, over and over, patient and sure. A. B, 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 B. Daniel would move his lips, not making sounds yet, but practicing the shapes of words that lived in his mouth but had never come out. Thomas would watch from doorways. He told himself he was supervising, making sure Ruth was doing the job correctly. But the truth was he couldn't look away. He was watching his son become human again, watching the ice that had formed around Daniel begin to crack. Ruth started leaving letters around the house, on the mantel, on the windowsills, in places where Daniel would find them throughout the day. A picture of an apple with an A beside it, a picture of a bird with a B beside it. Each one a small promise, a message in a language that was slowly becoming his son's language too. Ruth began to sing while she worked. Soft songs, old songs, songs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Daniel would follow the sound of her voice from room to room like she was a lighthouse, and he had been lost at sea. One afternoon, Thomas came home from town and found them sitting on the front steps. Ruth was holding a small book, one of Margaret's children's books, the one with pictures of animals on the cover. She was pointing to a picture. She was saying a word. "Cow." She was saying it clear and slow. "Cow." And Daniel's lips were moving. His face was screwed up in concentration. His small body was vibrating with the effort of it. Then, like a sound coming from very far away, like a voice calling across years of silence, Daniel made a noise. It wasn't a word. Not yet. It was just a sound. Just the beginning of the sound. Just the first breath of a word that had been trapped inside him for so long. Ruth's hand covered her mouth. Tears spilled from her eyes. She didn't make a sound, but her whole body was shaking, and Daniel, seeing her reaction, tried again. Again. Cow. Thomas found himself walking toward them without deciding to. Ruth looked up. She saw him standing there. Her face changed. She scrambled to her feet, the book falling to the steps behind her. She wiped her eyes quickly on her sleeve. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know I shouldn't have. I know the steps are not proper and I should be working and Daniel should be. We were just—" Ruth was backing away, her eyes downcast again, that familiar posture of apologizing for her own existence returning. Thomas held out his hand. "What you're doing," he said, "it's good." Ruth stopped moving. She stared at his hand like it might change into something dangerous if she wasn't careful. She was wrong. Thomas's hand wasn't dangerous. It was shaking. His whole body was shaking because something inside him had broken open and he didn't know how to close it again. Ruth slowly reached out. Her hand was smaller than he expected, rough, calloused from work, warm. He held it for a moment longer than was necessary, long enough that she looked up at him, confused. Her eyes were red from crying. Her face was flushed. In that moment, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Not because of her appearance, because of what she had done, because of what she had given his son, because of what she had brought back into a house that had been dying by inches. That night, Thomas sat in his study while Ruth cleaned the kitchen. He thought about the man he'd been before Daniel stopped speaking, a man who knew how to love his wife, a man who knew his place in the world, a man who thought he understood how things worked. That man was gone. The man sitting in the study now was someone different, someone who had lost everything and then, impossibly, been given something back by a woman whose name he'd barely known 3 months ago. He thought about what Ruth had told him, that she had a brother who never learned to read, that he had died young. Thomas realized he didn't know anything else about her. He didn't know where she came from. He didn't know what circumstances had brought her to his door. He didn't know if she had family or if she was alone in the world. He didn't know anything except that she had a gift for seeing into the darkness where his son lived and bringing him back toward the light. The next morning, Thomas called Ruth into his study. She came in like she was being summoned to her own execution, her hands folded, her eyes down, her entire body braced for criticism. Thomas gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Ruth sat. She didn't relax. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a prisoner in a courtroom waiting for a verdict. "I want to know about you," Thomas said. "About your background, your family, where you come from." Ruth's eyes widened slightly. She seemed to be calculating something, deciding what was safe to reveal. "Sir, I don't think that's relevant to my position here." Thomas disagreed. "It's relevant to me. I want to know who is teaching my son, who is living in my house. I want to know your story." Ruth was quiet for a long time, so long that Thomas thought she might refuse, that she might stand up and walk out and he would have to let her go because he had no claim on her beyond her employment. Finally, she spoke. "My parents died when I was young," she said. "Scarlet fever like here. My mother went first. My father followed her within a week. My uncle took me in. He had children of his own, 5 of them. We were poor, very poor. We lived on the outskirts of the city where people didn't ask questions about how you fed yourself." Ruth's voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. A current of old pain, old shame. "My uncle was a good man, but he drank. When he drank, he forgot that children needed things, like food, like kindness. We had a little brother, Michael. He was born when I was 12. I remember thinking, this is my chance. I can give him what I didn't get. I can teach him things. I can make sure he knows he's loved." Ruth's hands tightened in her lap. "When Michael was 5 years old, I started teaching him his letters. I made them from sticks. I drew them in the dirt. I found an old primer someone had thrown out. I taught him to read by the light of whatever fire I could make. He was so smart, so eager. He absorbed everything I gave him like he'd been thirsty his whole life." Ruth paused. Her voice changed. "When Michael was 7, he got sick. It was a cold that turned into something worse. I nursed him myself. I sat with him through the nights. I read to him from that primer even when he was too sick to focus on the words. He died on a Tuesday in December. It was very cold. Thomas listened. He didn't interrupt. He let Ruth's words fill the space between them. After he died, I couldn't stay in my uncle's house. Ruth continued. I couldn't look at his empty bed. I couldn't listen to my cousins playing outside knowing he would never play again. So I left when I was 15. I found work, cleaning houses, cooking, farm work, whatever I could find. I moved from place to place. I never stayed anywhere long because staying made it real, made it permanent. If I kept moving, I could pretend it hadn't happened. I could pretend Michael was still somewhere, learning to read by firelight, and I was just between visits. Ruth's eyes were still dry, but her voice cracked slightly. Then I came here. And I saw Daniel. And I saw my brother in his eyes. That hunger for connection. That desperate need to be seen and understood. And I thought maybe I could do for Daniel what I couldn't do for Michael. Maybe I could give him what Michael never got the chance to have. Ruth's hands loosened in her lap, and I thought maybe that would be enough. Thomas stood up. Ruth flinched, clearly thinking she was about to be dismissed. But Thomas walked around his desk and stood in front of her. He looked at this woman who had lost so much and asked for so little. This woman who had seen his broken son and loved him anyway. This woman who had carried her brother's ghost into his house and turned it into healing. I want you to stay, Thomas said. Not as a housekeeper. I want you to be Daniel's teacher. He needs that. And I think you need that too. Ruth looked up at him. Her eyes were confused. But I'm not qualified, she said. I haven't been schooled in teaching. It doesn't matter. You know how to reach him. That's more important than any qualification. Thomas paused. I want to pay you as a teacher, not as a housekeeper. You'll have your own room, better than what you have now. You'll have time to rest and to plan your lessons. You'll have access to any books in this house, any materials you need. I'll buy more if you ask for them. Ruth's hands were shaking now. Sir, she started, but she couldn't seem to finish. Why are you doing this? Thomas didn't have a good answer. He wasn't sure himself. Except that he knew what it felt like to lose someone. He knew what it felt like to think your life was over. And he knew that Ruth had somehow managed to take that loss and transform it into something beautiful. She'd taken her grief and turned it into teaching. She'd taken her pain and turned it into healing. She'd taken her love for a dead boy and given it to a living one who desperately needed it. That was extraordinary. That was worth everything he could give her. It's because you saved my son, Thomas said finally. And in doing that, you saved me too. Over the next 3 months, Ruth transformed Thomas's house into a learning space. She created a small schoolroom in what had been the morning room, a bright space with large windows that faced the garden. She set up a small table and 2 chairs. She arranged books on shelves. She created lessons that moved methodically through letters and sounds and then words. But more than that, she created a space where Daniel felt safe, where he felt valued, where he understood that his silence was not shameful but simply a different way of being in the world. Daniel began to speak, not all at once, not in a rush, but gradually, syllable by syllable, word by word, his voice came back. It started with single words, apple, bird, cow. Then it moved to simple phrases, the apple is red, the bird can fly, look at the cow. Then it became more complex. Daniel started to ask questions. Why is the bird flying? Where does the cow sleep? Ruth answered every question with patience and joy. She treated his curiosity like it was a precious gift. Thomas would listen from outside the schoolroom door and feel tears on his face. This was his son. This was Daniel, alive and engaged and part of the world again. And it was Ruth who had brought him back. But something else was happening too, something that Thomas tried to ignore at first and then found he couldn't. He was falling in love with Ruth. It wasn't a sudden thing. It wasn't the kind of love that struck like lightning. It was something deeper and slower. It was the way her face looked when she was concentrating on Daniel's lessons. It was the care she took in everything she did. It was the way she had rebuilt her own life after devastating loss. It was the fact that she asked nothing for herself, but took everything she needed from the act of helping someone else. Thomas had been in love once before. He had loved Margaret with the fierce passion of youth. They had chosen each other quickly, married young, built a life together. And then she was gone, and Thomas understood that love could destroy you as completely as any weapon. He had resigned himself to never feeling that way again, never wanting to, but Ruth was different. She didn't ask to be loved. She didn't try to take the place of Margaret in his life. She simply was, present and steady and extraordinary in her ordinariness. One evening, Thomas found Ruth sitting on the porch steps looking at the sunset. She was alone. Daniel was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet in that particular way that comes at the end of a long day. Ruth looked up when she heard the door open. She didn't move, but she shifted slightly, making space for him on the steps. Thomas sat beside her. They didn't speak. They just watched the sky change colors, watched the sun sink lower on the horizon, watched the first stars appear. After a long time, Ruth said, "Daniel asked me today why his mother isn't here anymore." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell him?" Ruth turned to face him. "I told him the truth. That people we love sometimes leave us. That it's not our fault and it's not something we can fix. That the best thing we can do is remember them and love the people who are still here." She paused. "I told him that his mother would be very proud of him for learning to read. I told him she would be proud of him for being brave." Thomas couldn't speak. He felt something in his throat, something that prevented words. Ruth reached over and took his hand. Her touch was gentle, not demanding, just present. "We've both lost people we loved," she said quietly. "We both know what that's like, and we both know that there is no timeline for grief, no formula for when it gets better. I don't know if it ever fully goes away." Thomas managed to speak. "Does yours?" Ruth considered the question. "Not entirely," she said, "but it changes. It stops being a wound and starts being a scar. It stops being something that bleeds and starts being something you just carry, something that tells you who you are, that you survived, that you loved deeply enough that losing it mattered." Thomas looked at her hand in his. He thought about how it felt to be touched again, how strange and wonderful and terrifying it was. "I'm afraid," he said. "Of what?" "Of needing you. Of losing you like I lost Margaret. Of my son losing you." He couldn't look at her as he said it, but she didn't let go of his hand. "If you're careful enough," Ruth said softly, "if you're cautious enough, you can avoid a lot of pain. You can live a whole life without risking anything, but you'll also never really live. You'll just exist. And I don't think that's what you want for yourself or for Daniel." Thomas looked at her then. Her face was open and honest, and full of a kind of bravery that he recognized, because he'd seen it in the way she moved through the world. The way she rebuilt herself after losing Michael. The way she loved Daniel even though loving him meant risking another loss. The way she was looking at him now, waiting for him to decide if he was brave enough to try. "I want to marry you," he said. It came out wrong. Too blunt. Too sudden. Ruth didn't pull her hand away, but her eyes widened. "That's a very large thing to say," she said carefully. "I know, and I'm not saying it easily. I've thought about it constantly for weeks. I understand if you're not ready. I understand if you need time. But I need you to know that I'm not asking you to replace anyone or to be anything except exactly who you are. A woman who saved my son. A woman I love. A woman I want to build a life with." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Thomas," she said, "that's not I mean I didn't expect." She took a breath. "Yes, Thomas, I'll marry you, that's my answer. Yes." They were married a month later in a small ceremony with only a handful of townspeople present. The ladies who had once turned Ruth away from the church kitchen attended out of curiosity, not kindness. But Thomas didn't care what they thought. He watched Ruth walk toward him in a simple white dress that Ruth herself had sewn, and he felt like the luckiest man alive. Daniel stood beside him as his best man, his small face serious and proud. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected to the marriage, there was a moment of tense silence. Thomas could feel the judgment in the room. A widower marrying a woman who had no family, a woman who had no dowry, a woman who existed outside of the normal structures that kept society organized and understandable. But no one spoke. No one stepped forward. And the ceremony continued. After they were married, Ruth's position in the household changed entirely. She was no longer the invisible housekeeper. She was the lady of the house. More importantly, she was Daniel's mother in all the ways that mattered except for the biological fact of birth. She gave him her name. She gave him her attention. She gave him the gift of being seen and loved and valued. And Thomas gave her what she had never had: safety, stability, a home that was truly hers, a place where her grief over Michael didn't have to be hidden but could be acknowledged and honored as part of her story. A place where she could build a life without constantly moving, without constantly running. The wedding had only been a week in the past when Thomas overheard a conversation that would change everything. He was in town, handling business at the bank, when he heard Ruth's name mentioned in a harsh whisper. He turned to see two women, friends of his late wife, standing near the counter with their heads bent together. "You're not truly shocked," one of them was saying. "A woman like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere without some kind of damage. She's a servant, a nobody." The other woman nodded eagerly. And to marry him, to get herself into such a position, it's obvious what she was after. His money, his property. That poor child doesn't even know he's being manipulated. Thomas felt rage move through him like fire. He walked toward the women. Both of them looked up, startled by his approach. His face must have been terrible because they flinched backward. "I don't know what you've heard or what you choose to believe," Thomas said quietly, and his quiet was more frightening than shouting would have been. "But I want you to understand something very clearly. My wife is the most honorable woman I have ever met. She came to my house with nothing but her own two hands and the content of her character. She didn't marry me for money. She married me because she loves my son and she loves me. And if I ever hear either of you speak about her with anything but respect, you will find yourselves dealing with me personally." He turned and left the bank. The transaction he'd come to complete would have to wait. He needed to get home. He needed to see Ruth. He needed to remind himself that there were people in the world who understood the difference between appearance and reality, who understood that a person's value wasn't determined by their lineage or their wealth or their social position. That sometimes the greatest gifts came from the most unexpected people. When he got home, he found Ruth in the schoolroom with Daniel. She was reading to him from a book that was clearly beyond what a 6-year-old would normally understand, but Daniel was following along, asking questions, engaged in the way he now always was. Ruth looked up when Thomas entered. Her face changed slightly, like she could see something in his expression that told her something was wrong. She finished the page and set the book down. "Daniel," she said softly, "can you go check on the garden? I want to know if the roses have bloomed yet." Daniel nodded and skipped out of the room. Once he was gone, Ruth stood and faced Thomas. What happened? Thomas told her what he'd heard. He expected her to be upset, to be offended, to cry or to rage or to do something that acknowledged the injustice of it. Instead, Ruth nodded like this was information she'd expected. She was kind about it, but she wasn't surprised. "These people, they need to believe there was a reason I couldn't stay in my own life," Ruth said. "They need to believe I was running from something shameful, or that I'm here now for shameful reasons. Because if people like me can be lifted up by love and hard work and being in the right place at the right time, then what does that say about their own lives? What does that say about the choices they made?" Thomas pulled her close. Her body was stiff at first, resistant, but then she leaned into him. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what? For them. For the way the world treats you. I chose this," Ruth said, pulling back to look at him. "I chose to accept your offer. I chose to teach Daniel. I chose to marry you. Every choice was mine, and I would make those choices again." "Yes," Thomas said, "I know, and that's why I love you." Over the next year, life settled into a rhythm that felt like healing. Daniel flourished. His reading became advanced for his age. His confidence grew. He began to speak not just in single words or simple sentences, but in full, complex thoughts. He became a different child, one who was engaged with the world and his place in it. And Ruth became the heart of their home in a way that Thomas realized had been missing even before Margaret died. Ruth had a gift for creating warmth, for making a house feel like a home, for seeing what people needed and providing it without being asked. The townspeople slowly began to accept her, not all of them. There would always be those who whispered, who looked at her with judgment, who couldn't quite believe that a woman of her station could have elevated herself so far. But enough of them began to see her for what she truly was: a good woman, a hard worker, a devoted mother to Daniel and wife to Thomas, a woman who had taken the worst of what life had to offer and transformed it into something beautiful. One evening, about a year after they were married, Ruth came to Thomas with something she needed to tell him. They were in their bedroom. The house was quiet. Daniel was asleep. The day was finished. Ruth was sitting on the edge of the bed, and she looked nervous in a way that Thomas hadn't seen since the early days. "What is it?" he asked. She took a breath. "I'm pregnant," she said. Thomas felt the world stop. For a moment he couldn't process the words, then he understood them. Ruth was going to have a baby, their baby, a new life. A physical manifestation of their love and their commitment to each other. He pulled her close. Tears streamed down his face, but he was smiling. "A baby," he said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He pulled back and looked at her. "I've never been happier." Ruth was silent for a moment. "I was afraid you might not be, that you might think it's too soon or that I'm overstepping somehow." But Thomas interrupted her. "Stop. Stop thinking that way. This is wonderful. You're wonderful. And this child, our child, will be a blessing." Ruth nodded, but Thomas could see the old patterns in her, the way she'd been trained to expect rejection, to apologize for her own existence, to diminish herself. He understood that healing wasn't a straight line. He understood that trauma left marks that didn't simply disappear because you married someone who loved you. But he was patient. He would spend the rest of his life, if necessary, showing Ruth that she deserved happiness, that she deserved to be loved, that she deserved to take up space in the world without apology. When the baby came, it was a girl. They named her Margaret, after Thomas's first wife, because Ruth insisted. She said it was important to honor the woman who had come before, who had loved Thomas and Daniel, who was still very much part of their family story. Thomas had worried this would be painful, naming a child after the woman he'd lost. But he found that it wasn't. It was a way of acknowledging that you could love more than one person, that a heart had room for many kinds of love, that the past and the present could coexist without one diminishing the other. Ruth was a natural mother to the baby. She cradled her with a tenderness that came from some deep well inside her. Thomas would watch her and think about Michael, about the brother she'd lost, about the grief that had driven her and shaped her. But more than that, he thought about the way she'd transformed that grief into healing, the way she'd taken her loss and turned it into love for his son, for him, for this new child who would grow up knowing both parents, both kinds of love. One morning, about 6 months after little Margaret was born, Thomas came down to find Ruth in the kitchen with Daniel. They were baking. There was flour everywhere. Daniel was standing on a stool at the counter, his small hands covered in dough. Ruth was behind him, her hands over his, guiding him through the motions of kneading. She was singing softly. It was a song Thomas had never heard before, something old and haunting and beautiful. Daniel was laughing. He was actually laughing, this child who hadn't laughed in years, who hadn't had joy in his voice until Ruth came into his life. Thomas stood in the doorway and just watched them. He watched Ruth guide Daniel's hands. He watched her kiss the top of his head. He watched her love him with the kind of love that comes from choosing each one of them, every single day. And Thomas understood something in that moment that he'd been beginning to understand for a long time, but had never quite put into words. Ruth wasn't just a housekeeper who had taught his son to read. She wasn't just a woman he'd married out of gratitude or compassion. She was the woman who had rebuilt his family from the ground up. She was the woman who had loved his son back to life. She was the woman who had taken her own devastating loss and transformed it into the foundation for a new kind of family. She was everything. She was home. Thomas walked into the kitchen. Ruth looked up, surprised. Daniel turned on his stool. Both of them had flour in their hair. Both of them were smiling. Daniel said, looking at his father with joy in his eyes, "Ruth is teaching me to make bread like her mother taught her." Ruth's eyes went soft. She didn't try to hide the tears that had started to slide down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, "my mother taught me, and now I'm teaching you, and someday you'll teach someone else." Thomas looked at his son. For the first time, he understood what Ruth had always known. That teaching wasn't just about letters and words and reading. It was about transmitting love across time. It was about taking what you'd been given, what you'd learned, what you'd survived, and giving it to someone else. It was about breaking the cycle of loss and trauma by choosing connection instead, by choosing to love, by choosing to stay. The next week, Ruth received a letter. Thomas had been there when it arrived. The messenger had come to the door specifically asking for Ruth by name. It was unusual enough that it drew attention. Ruth took the letter with trembling hands. She went to sit in the parlor, and Thomas sat beside her while she opened it. The letter was brief. It was from a man who identified himself as Ruth's cousin. He said he'd been looking for her for 3 years. He said he had information about her family. He said he had found something that might matter to her. He wanted to meet. Ruth's hands shook as she read it. Thomas waited for her to tell him what it said. Finally, Ruth looked up. "I want to go," she said, "to meet with him. I need to know what he has to tell me." Thomas nodded. "Of course. I'll go with you." So they went to the city, to a small tea room in the respectable part of town. Ruth's cousin was waiting. He was a thin man with Ruth's dark eyes. He stood when they entered. He took Ruth's hands. "I've been looking for you for so long," he said. "I wanted to make sure you knew that you weren't alone. That family mattered." He reached into a bag beside his chair and pulled out a small bundle of letters. "These," he said, "are from your uncle. He wrote them to you after you left. He never sent them because he didn't know where you were, but he wanted you to know that he loved you, that leaving was the right thing to do, that he understood why you had to go." Ruth took the letters with shaking hands. She opened the first one and began to read. Tears streamed silently down her face as she read the words her uncle had written years ago, words that had been waiting for her in the dark like a secret kept by time itself. Thomas watched her read, watching the subtle shifts in her expression as she moved from one letter to the next. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat beside her, present, steady, the way she had been present and steady for Daniel. The tea in their cups went cold. Other patrons of the small establishment came and went. Ruth's cousin sat quietly across from them, giving her space, understanding that this moment belonged to her alone. When Ruth finished reading the last letter, she held all of them against her chest and closed her eyes. Her uncle's words had done something remarkable. They had transformed her entire understanding of the past. He hadn't blamed her for leaving. He hadn't condemned her choices. Instead, he had spent years trying to tell her that he understood, that he loved her still, that she had made the only decision she could have made given the circumstances that had driven her away. Ruth's cousin leaned forward gently. He said, "I also have news about your mother." Ruth's entire body went rigid. Her eyes opened. Thomas felt it, the way fear and hope collided in her chest, the way the past suddenly felt very close, very real, very capable of changing everything once again. Her cousin continued carefully. "Your mother," he said, "survived the fever that took your sister. She recovered, though it took many months. She asked about you constantly. She spent years trying to find you. She died believing that you were lost to her forever. But before she died, she left something for you, a letter of her own, and a small chest of your childhood things. She wanted you to have them should you ever be found." Ruth made a sound that was barely human. something between a sob and a gasp, the sound of old wounds suddenly reopening, of grief that had been held at bay for so long finally finding permission to pour forth. Thomas reached over and took her hand. He didn't try to comfort her with words. Words seemed impossibly inadequate in the face of what she was experiencing. Her cousin produced a small leather chest from beneath the table. It was worn, carefully maintained, clearly handled with great love over the years. He placed it gently in front of Ruth. "Inside," he said, "are the things your mother kept. Letters she wrote to you that she never sent. A lock of your sister's hair preserved, your christening gown, a drawing you made as a child, all the pieces of your life that she refused to let disappear even when you were gone from her sight." Ruth couldn't open it. Not yet. She stared at the chest as though it contained something far more fragile than objects, as though it held the very possibility of redemption, and opening it might somehow break the spell, might reveal that it was all too good to be true, that her family's love hadn't actually survived the years of separation and loss. Thomas gently took the chest and set it aside. "Not now," he said quietly to Ruth's cousin. "My wife will need time with this, but I want to say thank you. Thank you for finding her. Thank you for taking the time, for keeping these things safe." The cousin nodded. He understood perfectly. Family was what mattered. Family was what endured. He gave Ruth his address and asked her to write to him, to stay in contact, to let him know how she was. He said he had other cousins who would want to know she was well, that she was cared for, that she had found a home. The journey back to the ranch was quiet. Ruth sat beside Thomas in the carriage, the leather chest on her lap, her hands resting on it but not opening it. She stared out the window at the changing landscape, at the way the land transformed as they moved further from the city and back toward the open plains. When they arrived at the ranch, Daniel was waiting on the porch, anxious, wondering where they had gone and why they had left without explanation. Ruth went to him immediately and held him, and over his shoulder she looked at Thomas with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. It was the look of someone who had finally been allowed to stop running, to stop hiding, to stop pretending that the past didn't exist. That night, after Daniel was asleep, Ruth sat in the study with Thomas and finally opened the chest. The first thing she removed was the christening gown, delicate white fabric, yellowed slightly with age but carefully preserved. She held it to her face and breathed in, and Thomas saw her shoulders tremble. Next came the letters. Her mother's handwriting was elegant, formal, but beneath the careful penmanship was a river of emotion that ran deep and urgent. Ruth read passages aloud to Thomas, and he heard the voice of a woman who had desperately loved her daughter, who had grieved the loss of her, who had spent years constructing a narrative that allowed her to believe her daughter was alive somewhere, building a life, finding happiness. There was a letter dated just weeks before her mother's death. In it, her mother had written, "My dearest Ruth, if these words ever reach you, I want you to know that I have forgiven you for leaving. I forgave you the moment you walked out the door because I understood even then that you were saving yourself. A mother's first duty is to want her child to live, truly live, not merely to exist. I wanted you to have that. I wanted you to find a place in this world where you could be loved for exactly who you are. I never got to see it happen, but I spent every day of my life believing that it would. I died believing in you. I died believing that somewhere you were well, that somewhere you were happy, that somewhere you were loved." Ruth sobbed openly as she read these words. Thomas held her, and she clung to him the way she had learned to cling to life itself after years of believing she had lost the right to exist at all. The past wasn't chasing her anymore. It was finally releasing her from its grip, but the story wasn't finished. Ruth's cousin had included a final piece of information in a separate note. He had written that there was a small inheritance, not substantial but meaningful. Their mother's brother, Ruth's uncle, had left instructions that should Ruth ever be found, a modest sum was to be transferred to her. It was enough to ensure her security, enough to guarantee that she would never be without resources, never be vulnerable in the way she had been vulnerable before. Ruth read this information and looked at Thomas. She said, "I don't know what to do with this. I never expected to have anything. I never thought." Thomas interrupted gently. "You do what you think is right," he said. "That's all anyone can do. That's all you've ever done." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to set up a school, here, on the ranch and in the nearby town. I want to teach children who would otherwise never learn to read. I want to teach them the way my mother taught me, and the way I've been teaching Daniel. I want to take what I've survived and use it to help others survive and thrive. I want to take the love that was given to me and pass it forward." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. He understood in that moment that he had not been the one saving Ruth. They had been saving each other. She had come into his life when he was drowning in his inability to connect with his own son, and she had shown him how to love again. And now he had the privilege of helping her build something that mattered, something that would outlast both of them. Within 6 months, the school was established. It was a small building situated between the ranch and the nearest town, and Ruth taught there 3 days a week. On the other days, she continued to teach Daniel and several other children from neighboring ranches, whose parents recognized that their sons and daughters deserved education and opportunity. Daniel transformed under Ruth's instruction. The sullen, hostile boy who had been so difficult when she first arrived became engaged, curious, hungry for knowledge. He learned to read with remarkable speed, and more importantly, he learned to think. He learned to question, to wonder, to see the world as a place full of possibility rather than limitation. But it was Ruth who changed the most profoundly. As she taught, as she built her school, as she received letters from her cousin and slowly began to reconnect with her extended family, she seemed to shed layers of old pain like a snake shedding skin. She laughed more. She smiled more. She began to take pleasure in small things, the quality of light in the morning, the taste of fresh bread, the feeling of Daniel's hand in hers as they walked through the town. Thomas found himself falling in love with her all over again, this time with a depth and intensity that was grounded in true knowledge of who she was. He loved her not despite her past, but partly because of it. He loved her strength, her resilience, her refusal to let her circumstances define her. He loved the way she had chosen, against all odds, to believe in the possibility of goodness. One evening, about a year after Ruth's cousin had found her, Thomas asked her to marry him. He did it simply, without elaborate ceremony. He asked her in the kitchen where they had spent so many hours together, where she had first taught Daniel to read, where they had baked bread together and laughed together and slowly, quietly, rebuilt each other's faith in the world. Ruth said yes immediately, but then she paused. She said, "Thomas, there's something I need to tell you, something I haven't told anyone yet." Thomas waited, his heart suddenly beating faster. He had learned that with Ruth, there were always more layers, more stories, more truths waiting to emerge. Ruth took a deep breath. She said, "I received a letter from my cousin last week. He told me that my father is still alive. He's elderly now and he's ill, but he's alive. And he's asked to see me. He wants to meet with me before he dies." Thomas felt the weight of this information. Ruth's father was the man who had driven her away in the first place, the man whose disapproval and anger had made her feel that she had no choice but to leave her entire life behind. "What do you want to do?" Thomas asked carefully. Ruth looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she said. "Part of me is angry at him still. Part of me wants nothing to do with him. But another part of me is curious. I want to know if he's changed. I want to know if he understands what he did to me. I want to know if there's any possibility of forgiveness, not because he deserves it, but because I deserve the peace of it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we'll go," he said. "We'll go together and we'll see what happens. But Ruth, you don't owe him anything. You don't owe him forgiveness if you can't give it. You only owe yourself honesty." Ruth leaned against him, and they stood together in the gathering darkness. Two people who had been broken in different ways and had found each other in the wreckage, had built something new and strong and real. The letter from Ruth's father arrived a week later. Thomas brought it to her, recognizing the careful handwriting on the envelope. Ruth opened it with trembling hands. The letter was short. It said, "My dear daughter Ruth, I do not know if this letter will reach you, or if you will even wish to read it should it do so. I have spent many years regretting the words I spoke to you on the day you left. I have spent many years wishing I could take them back, wishing I could tell you that I was wrong. But wishes are the indulgence of cowards, and I have been a coward for far too long. If you are willing, I would like to see you before I die. I would like to tell you face to face that I am sorry. I would like to ask your forgiveness, though I understand I may not deserve it. If you choose not to come, I will understand that too. But I hope you will give me this chance. Your loving father, though I know I have not earned the right to call myself that in many years." Ruth read the letter 3 times. Each time she wept. Thomas held her and asked her what she wanted to do, and Ruth said, "I need to go. I need to see him. I need to hear him say these words in person, need to look into his eyes and decide if I believe him." They made arrangements to travel to the city where Ruth's father was living. It was a difficult journey, and Ruth was anxious the entire way. She had spent so many years believing that her father hated her, that he was immovable in his judgment. The possibility that he might have changed, that he might have softened, that he might have come to regret his cruelty. It was almost more difficult to bear than the certainty of his hatred had been. When they arrived at her father's house, Ruth nearly turned back. Thomas had to take her hand and gently lead her forward. The door opened before they could knock, and a woman who appeared to be a nurse stood in the entrance. She smiled warmly when she saw Ruth and said, "He's been waiting for you. He's in the study. He's having a good day today, thank the Lord." Ruth and Thomas exchanged a glance. Then Ruth straightened her shoulders and walked into the house. Her father was sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the street below. He was much smaller than Ruth remembered, diminished by age and illness. When he turned to look at her, his eyes filled immediately with tears. "Ruth," he said. "My Ruth, you came." Ruth found that she could not speak. All the words she had prepared, all the things she had wanted to say, had evaporated the moment she saw him. She stood in the doorway, caught between the past and the present, between anger and something that might possibly be forgiveness. Her father gestured for her to come closer. Ruth obeyed. She sat in a chair across from him, and Thomas stood quietly by the door, giving them space but remaining present, remaining witness. "I have been a foolish man," Ruth's father said without preamble. "A proud man and a foolish man. I let my pride convince me that your choices were a reflection on me, on my honor, on my standing in the world. I was so afraid of what people would think, so afraid of being judged, that I forgot to love my daughter. I forgot that you were more important than any reputation, any social standing, any of the things I thought mattered so desperately." Ruth listened. Her father continued. "I have been ill for 2 years now," he said. "And in that illness I have had nothing to do but think about my life, about my choices, about the people I have hurt. I thought of you constantly. I wondered where you were, if you were safe, if you were happy. I wondered if I had destroyed you with my cruelty, or if you had somehow found a way to survive and even to thrive despite what I had done." Ruth's father reached out a shaking hand toward her. "I won't ask you to forgive me," he said. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I am asking you to believe that I love you, that I have always loved you, even when I was too stupid and too proud to show it. That losing you was the greatest punishment I could have received, and it was a punishment I deserved." Ruth felt something break open inside her chest. It was not anger breaking open. The anger had been slowly dissolving for months now, ever since she had received her uncle's letters, ever since she had learned that her family had loved her still, even in her absence. What broke open was the last dam holding back her grief, her sorrow for all the years lost, all the connections severed, all the love that could have been shared but wasn't. She stood up and moved toward her father, and she took his shaking hands in hers. She said, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, as you said, but because I deserve the peace of it. Because I have spent too many years carrying hatred and I am tired. I am so tired." Her father wept openly then, and Ruth found herself weeping with him, and Thomas watched from his place by the door, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred, a moment of true reconciliation, of genuine transformation, of the possibility of healing even after years of injury and pain. They spent the afternoon together. Ruth's father asked her about her life, about Thomas, about Daniel, about the school she had founded. Ruth told him everything, not the carefully edited version, but the whole truth, all of it, the darkness and the light both. And her father listened without judgment, with nothing but love and regret and deep, genuine interest in his daughter's life. As the sun began to set, and Thomas gently suggested that they should return to their rooms at the inn, Ruth's father took her hand one more time. He said, "I don't have much time left. The doctor has told me that I have perhaps 6 months, perhaps less. But I am grateful to have had this time with you. I am grateful for the chance to tell you that I'm sorry, to tell you that I love you. That is more than I deserved." Ruth squeezed his hand. She said, "I will come back. As often as I can, I will come back and spend time with you. We have lost so many years already. I don't want to waste any more of them." And she kept that promise. Over the following months, Ruth traveled back to the city regularly, spending time with her father, watching as he slowly weakened but also slowly seemed to find peace. She brought Thomas sometimes, and she brought Daniel once, and her father wept with joy at meeting his grandson, at seeing the possibility of family continuing, of love being transmitted across generations. When her father died, Ruth grieved, but it was a clean grief, untainted by anger or regret. She had said everything that needed to be said. She had forgiven him fully, and in forgiving him, she had freed herself from the last chains of her past. But the story doesn't end with her father's death. That was merely another chapter, another piece of the larger narrative that Ruth had been writing with her life, with her choices, with her refusal to let her circumstances dictate her destiny. A year after her father's death, Ruth discovered that she was pregnant. She and Thomas had been married for 2 years by this point, and the news brought them profound joy. Daniel was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a big brother. Ruth's cousins sent congratulations from across the country. The entire community seemed to celebrate with them. Ruth continued to teach school throughout her pregnancy. She swelled with new life, and it seemed symbolic. The woman who had once believed she had no right to exist, no right to be loved, no right to contribute anything of value to the world, was literally creating new life, nurturing it, preparing to bring it into the world. Thomas watched her with amazement. He would sometimes catch her standing in the schoolroom, teaching Daniel and the other children their lessons, her hand resting on her belly, and he would think about the journey she had taken to get here. He thought about the day she had arrived at his ranch, desperate and broken, and about the transformation that had occurred not just in her, but in all of them. The baby was born on a spring morning, and it was a girl. Ruth held her in her arms and wept with joy, and Thomas held them both, and Daniel peered over his father's shoulder with wonder in his eyes. They named her Hope, because that's what she was, the physical manifestation of all the hope that Ruth had learned to carry, all the belief in possibility that she had slowly, painstakingly rebuilt. As Ruth fed her daughter, she thought about her mother, about the mother who had died believing in her, believing that Ruth would find happiness, find love, find a place in the world. And Ruth understood that she was now living that happiness, now embodying that love, now fulfilling the promise that her mother had clung to before she died. But even as Ruth held her daughter, even as she experienced the deepest contentment of her life, she knew that her story was still unfolding. There were still mysteries to uncover, still pieces of her past that had not yet revealed themselves, still transformations waiting to occur. One evening, 3 months after Hope's birth, Ruth was tucking Daniel into bed when he asked her a question that would set the entire household on an unexpected course. He was nearly 11 now, tall for his age, with his father's sharp eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature. She had come to think of him entirely as her own, though she had never formally adopted him. There had never seemed to be a need. The bond between them transcended paperwork. "Ruth," he said, his small hand gripping her sleeve before she could leave the room, "why don't you ever talk about your family, where you came from before you came here?" It was the kind of innocent question a child asks, the sort that adults often dodge with vague answers and hurried distractions. But Ruth had made a promise to herself years ago that she would never lie to the children in her life, never use evasion as a tool the way her past had been obscured from her. She sat back down on the edge of his bed, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. "That's a fair question," she said, "and you deserve a real answer. The truth is, my family was complicated. My father and I didn't have a good relationship for a long time. We were separated, and I believed things about him that turned out not to be entirely true." Daniel absorbed this with the seriousness of a child who sensed he was being treated as someone worth the truth. "But you made it better before he died." "Yes," Ruth said, "we did. That's one of the things I'm most grateful for." What Ruth didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that this conversation had planted a seed in Daniel's mind. He began to think about family, about the mysteries and secrets that lived in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. And being the intelligent, curious child he was, he began to ask questions around town, in the way that children do, questions that seemed innocent but that contained within them a kind of detective work. It was Thomas who first noticed something was off. About a week after Daniel's bedtime conversation with Ruth, the schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor, who had remained unmarried and devoted to her work, mentioned to Thomas that Daniel had been asking her questions about Ruth. Specifically, he wanted to know if she remembered anything about Ruth's background, about where she had come from, about whether there was anything unusual about her arrival in the community. Thomas felt a strange prickle of unease. He mentioned it to Ruth that evening after Daniel had gone to bed and Hope had been put down for the night. Ruth was nursing a cup of tea, looking out the window at the darkening landscape, the mountains turning purple in the distance. "He's a smart boy," Thomas said carefully. "Maybe too smart for his own good. He's been asking questions." Ruth turned to face him, and Thomas saw something flicker across her face. Not fear exactly, but a kind of recognition. As if she had always known this day would come, as if some part of her had been waiting for it. "What kind of questions?" she asked. Thomas relayed what Miss Eleanor had told him. He watched Ruth's face as he spoke, trying to read her expression. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "I think," she said slowly, "that it's time I told you something. Something I haven't told anyone except my father, and even then, I only told him part of it." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. In the years they had been together, Ruth had shared many painful details of her past, her mother's death, her father's abandonment, the years of struggle. But he sensed that what she was about to tell him was different. This was something that had been locked away in a compartment of her heart, something she had been reluctant even to examine herself. "I'm listening," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Ruth set down her teacup with careful deliberation. Her hands, Thomas noticed, were trembling slightly. "When I was 15, she began, "before my mother died, before everything fell apart, something happened. Something that no one knew about except my mother. I was involved with a boy, a young man, really. He was 17, and he came from one of the wealthier families in our town. His name was James Carruthers." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, some instinctive male response to hearing another man's name emerge from his wife's past, but he forced himself to remain still and quiet. "I thought I was in love with him," Ruth continued. "I was a foolish girl, and he paid attention to me, which made me feel special. My mother saw what was happening and she warned me. She told me he wasn't serious about me, that boys like him didn't marry girls like us. But I didn't listen. I thought I knew better. I thought love was enough." Ruth paused, and in that pause, Thomas understood that the worst part of the story was coming. He left town, Ruth said. Just left, without explanation, without goodbye. And 2 weeks later I realized I was pregnant. The word hung in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Thomas felt his breath catch. Pregnant, Ruth at 15, pregnant. I was terrified, Ruth said quietly. My mother was devastated but not angry, never angry. She held me while I cried and she helped me figure out what to do. We couldn't tell anyone. A girl in my position, unmarried and pregnant, there was no path forward in that world. So we made a plan. My mother knew a woman, a midwife, who could help. The baby was born. It was a girl. She was beautiful. She had dark hair and tiny, perfect hands. Ruth's voice had become almost inaudible now. I held her for only a few minutes, Ruth whispered. My mother insisted. She said it would be better if I didn't look at her face, if I didn't hold her too long. There was a family, a good family, she said, who wanted a child. The arrangement had been made. And so my daughter was taken away, and I never saw her again. Thomas felt the room tilt slightly. A daughter. Ruth had a daughter, given away when she was barely more than a child herself. The weight of this revelation settled over him like a heavy blanket. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, not unkindly but with genuine bewilderment. "In all our years together, why didn't you tell me?" "Because," Ruth said, "I couldn't bear to say it out loud. Because I had convinced myself that if I never spoke of it, if I never acknowledged it, then perhaps I could believe it had never happened. And because I was ashamed. I was ashamed that I had been so foolish, so reckless. I was ashamed that I had let my daughter be taken from me without more of a fight. I was ashamed that even now, even after all these years, I don't know if she's alive, if she's happy, if she thinks of me at all." Thomas crossed the space between them and knelt in front of Ruth's chair. He took her hands in his. "You were a child," he said firmly. "You were a child in impossible circumstances. There is nothing to be ashamed of." But even as he said it, Thomas was thinking about Daniel, about what this revelation might mean, about the way that secrets have a way of surfacing, of demanding to be acknowledged. He was thinking about the girl who was out there somewhere in the world, Ruth's daughter, living a life completely separate from this, unaware of the mother who had thought of her across all the years, unaware of the loss that had shaped Ruth's entire existence. Over the next several days, Thomas watched Ruth carefully. She seemed more fragile somehow, as if the act of speaking her secret aloud had cracked something within her that had been carefully sealed. But at the same time, there was a strange kind of relief in her expression, as if a burden she had carried in silence for so long had finally been put down. Daniel, mercifully, seemed to abandon his detective work for the time being, distracted by his own teenage interests. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion, that the universe had a way of insisting on truth, of pushing secrets out of the shadows and into the light. It was about 2 weeks later that the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the post rider who made his rounds through the ranch country once a week. Thomas found Ruth standing in the kitchen, holding the envelope, her face completely drained of color. Her hands were shaking. "It's from a lawyer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A lawyer in the city. Ruth, there's something here. They're asking about a birth. They're asking if I'm Ruth Eleanor Markham, born 1865. Thomas's heart began to race. He took the letter from her hands and read it himself. The language was formal and legal, but what it was saying was extraordinary. A woman named Catherine Adelaide Westmore, age 28, unmarried but of considerable means, had recently passed away. In her will, she had instructed her lawyer to locate her biological mother, if she could be found. She had left detailed instructions, a series of clues that had led the lawyer to believe that Ruth was likely the woman in question. The lawyer was writing to request a meeting to discuss the matter further. Catherine Adelaide Westmore, their daughter. 15 years after she was born, 13 years after Ruth had buried the pain of her loss so deep that she barely acknowledged it existed. Ruth sank into a chair. Thomas watched as tears began to stream down her face, tears of shock and grief and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "She's dead," Ruth whispered. "My daughter is dead and I never even knew her." Thomas knelt beside her again, holding her as she wept. But even in his own shock and sorrow, he was thinking practically, thinking about what needed to happen next. The lawyer wanted to meet. There were details to discuss, a will to examine, questions to be answered. Over the course of the next week, Ruth and Thomas made arrangements to travel to the city. Thomas's ranch manager could oversee operations in his absence. Daniel would stay with Thomas's mother, who lived nearby. Ruth would take a leave from her teaching position. The headmaster granted it without question, understanding that something significant had occurred, though Ruth couldn't bring herself to explain the full details. The journey to the city took 2 days by rail. Ruth spent most of it staring out the window, her hand clasped tightly in Thomas's. She had built such a careful life, such a structured existence, after her years of desperation and pain. She had convinced herself that the past was past, that it could be compartmentalized and managed. But life, as Ruth was learning for what felt like the 100th time, had a way of refusing to stay neatly ordered. The lawyer's office was on the 3rd floor of an imposing stone building in downtown. The lawyer himself, Mr. Frederick Ashton, was a man of perhaps 60, with gray whiskers and kind eyes. He stood to greet them as they entered, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone trained to handle delicate matters. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, addressing Ruth directly, "thank you for coming. I imagine this must be quite a shock for you." Ruth nodded, unable to speak. Thomas squeezed her hand reassuringly. Mr. Ashton gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Once they were seated, he opened a file and withdrew several documents. "Let me explain what I know," he said. "Catherine Westmore was the adopted daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gregory Westmore. They were, by all accounts, loving and devoted parents. Catherine was a brilliant woman. She had a gift for mathematics and languages, and she developed a successful business involving the manufacture and sale of certain medicinal products. She never married, though she had several suitors. She was, it seems, devoted to her work." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Last year, Catherine was diagnosed with a grave illness. As her condition worsened, she became increasingly preoccupied with questions of identity and origin. She instructed me to locate her biological parents. Her adoptive parents had left her with very few details, but Catherine was resourceful. She managed to piece together certain information: the town she was from, the approximate date of her birth, certain identifying details. She was quite determined that if she could not have a life with her biological family, she would at least know who they were." Ruth felt the room beginning to spin slightly. She gripped the arms of the chair. "Did you find her father?" she asked suddenly. "Did you locate James Carruthers?" Mr. Ashton shook his head. "There was a James Carruthers in the town you're from, but he passed away approximately 10 years ago. He never married, and there were no records suggesting he had any children. I'm afraid he never knew of his daughter's existence." This struck Ruth with an unexpected force. James had never known. Catherine had never known. All those years, 3 people had walked the earth, completely unaware of the biological connection that bound them together. The waste of it, the tragedy of it, seemed almost unbearable. Catherine was aware that her biological father might not be located, Mr. Ashton continued gently. She made peace with that. But finding her mother was something she made specifically clear that she wanted. She was quite firm on the subject. He opened another document, this one handwritten. Even from a distance, Ruth could see that the handwriting was neat and precise. "This is a letter," Mr. Ashton said. "Catherine wrote it about 3 months before her death. She instructed me to give it to her biological mother should I be successful in locating her. I have it here if you would like to read it." Ruth felt Thomas's hand move to her back, supporting her. She reached out and took the letter. For a long moment she simply stared at the envelope, unable to open it. Her daughter. Her daughter had written to her, not knowing if the letter would ever be read, but hoping. Catherine had hoped that somehow, across the years and the distance and the separation, she might reach the woman who had given her life. Finally, with trembling fingers, Ruth opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was not long, but every word seemed to carry enormous weight. Catherine wrote of her life, of her parents' love for her, of her accomplishments. She wrote about the day she learned she was adopted, of the questions that had haunted her ever since. She wrote about her illness, about the strange way that facing one's own mortality makes you want to understand your origins, to trace the line of your own existence backward through time. And then Catherine wrote something that made Ruth's breath catch. I want you to know, whoever you are, that I have lived a good life. I have been loved. I have loved in return. I have done meaningful work. I have contributed something to the world. Whatever circumstances led to my adoption, whatever pain or desperation you may have felt at that time, I want you to know that the outcome was good. I exist, and I am grateful for that existence. I am grateful for you, for the choice you made, even if that choice was made in sorrow. Ruth could read no further. She set the letter down and wept openly, not caring that a stranger was witnessing her grief. Thomas pulled her close and she clung to him, her entire body shaking with the force of her emotions. When she finally composed herself enough to look up, she saw something that surprised her. Mr. Ashton's eyes were also wet. She was a remarkable woman, he said quietly. I had the privilege of knowing her for several years. She asked about you often, wondered about you. I believe, had she lived longer, she would have taken the journey to find you in person. Tell me about her, Ruth whispered. Please, I want to know everything. And so Mr. Ashton began to tell her about Catherine. He spoke of her business acumen, of the way she had doubled her parents' already substantial fortune through clever investments and innovations. He spoke of her friends, of the women's societies she had been involved with, of the ways she had worked to improve conditions for working women in the city. He spoke of her wit, her intelligence, her compassion. He retrieved a photograph from a drawer in his desk. Ruth looked at the image and felt something inside her break and reform simultaneously. Catherine was a striking woman, with dark hair and serious eyes. She was dressed elegantly, and there was something in her expression that spoke of both intelligence and kindness. Ruth could see herself in those eyes. She could also see James, she realized. Catherine had his high cheekbones, his strong jawline. She looks like a person who accomplished important things, Ruth said slowly. She did, Mr. Ashton confirmed. And I believe she was very much shaped by the love her parents gave her. The Westmores were good people. They raised her with every advantage, but more importantly, they raised her to be kind and thoughtful. Whatever else happened, Catherine's life was a success. Over the next several hours, Mr. Ashton walked Ruth and Thomas through the details of Catherine's will. There was money, a substantial inheritance that was now Ruth's, held in trust. There were Catherine's personal effects, her journals, her letters. There was a house in the city, left to Ruth as well. There was also a smaller bequest to Ruth's father's memory. Catherine had learned of his death and had wanted to make a donation to a charity in his name. By the time they left Mr. Ashton's office, Ruth's understanding of her own story had fundamentally shifted. Catherine had not been a shameful secret, a lost child to be forgotten. Catherine had been a person. She had been a woman of consequence, a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply. And in the end, she had loved Ruth, a mother she had never met, loved her enough to want to ensure that Ruth knew her story, knew that her daughter had thrived. The train ride home seemed to pass in a daze. Ruth held the stack of Catherine's journals in her lap, running her fingers over the leather covers but not yet opening them. She wasn't ready to read Catherine's words, wasn't ready to fully inhabit the life of this daughter who had existed parallel to her own. That would require a kind of emotional readiness that Ruth was still in the process of acquiring. But one thing had become clear. Her daughter had loved her. not with the complicated, painful love of a child and parent bound by blood and history and trauma, but with the pure, generous love of one human being recognizing another, of one soul seeing the struggle in another's journey and extending compassion across the distance. When they arrived home, Daniel was waiting on the porch. He had grown slightly in the weeks they'd been away, or perhaps Ruth was simply noticing him differently. He threw his arms around Ruth, asking 100 questions about the city, about what they'd done, what they'd seen. Ruth answered mechanically, her mind still partly somewhere else. That night, after Daniel had been put to bed and Hope was asleep in her cradle, Ruth finally opened one of Catherine's journals. She read by lamplight while Thomas sat nearby, reading his own book, offering silent companionship. Catherine's handwriting was the same neat script as the letter, careful, precise, deliberate. The first entry was dated more than 10 years earlier. Catherine wrote about having just learned of her adoption, about the strange feeling of discovering that everything she thought she knew about herself was incomplete. She wrote about asking her parents questions, about their answers being kind but not fully satisfying, about the hunger that grew within her to understand where she came from. Over the subsequent entries, Ruth watched her daughter grow from a confused girl into a thoughtful woman. Catherine wrote about her studies, about her business ventures, about her friendships and her disappointments. She wrote about falling in love with a woman named Margaret, a fact that struck Ruth with some surprise, but which she accepted with the grace of someone who had learned, over many years, that love took many forms, and that who a person loved was far less important than how they loved, how deeply and honestly and faithfully they loved. Catherine and Margaret had not been allowed to marry, of course, in the society they inhabited. But they had chosen to spend their lives together, and Catherine's journals were filled with tender references to Margaret, with gratitude for her presence, with the quiet joy of being known and accepted by another person. Ruth found herself weeping again, but this time the tears were for the life her daughter had lived, not just for the daughter she had lost. Catherine had been happy. Catherine had loved and been loved. She had made a mark on the world. She had done good things. In the end, Catherine had reached across the void that separated them and extended forgiveness, or perhaps more than forgiveness, understanding. Days turned into weeks. Ruth continued to read Catherine's journals, slowly absorbing the inner life of the woman her daughter had been. She found Catherine's business records and began to understand the financial acumen that had built such a substantial fortune. She read Catherine's correspondence with Margaret, carefully preserving these intimate documents even though they would never have been made public in her daughter's lifetime. And gradually something shifted in Ruth. The grief remained, would always remain, but it became transformed into something else. Grief mixed with pride, grief mixed with wonder, grief mixed with gratitude for having been given, in the end, the gift of knowing who her daughter had been. It was Daniel who noticed the change most acutely. One afternoon, finding Ruth looking through Catherine's photograph collection, he asked her directly what was going on. Ruth looked at her son, for that's how she thought of him, entirely and completely, and made a decision. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something about myself and about family and about secrets." And so Ruth told Daniel the full story. She told him about her pregnancy at 15, about the daughter she had given away, about the letter that had arrived, about Catherine. She showed him the photograph of his half-sister, for that's what Catherine was, in a sense, though Daniel would never know her in life. Daniel listened with the seriousness of an intelligent young man who was beginning to understand that the world was more complicated than he had previously realized. When Ruth finished, he asked thoughtfully, "Do you wish you had raised her, that you had kept her?" It was the kind of question that cut directly to the heart of Ruth's pain. She took a long moment to answer, choosing her words carefully. "I wish many things," she said finally. "I wish I had been old enough and wise enough to make better choices. I wish I had had options that I didn't have. But no, I don't wish I had raised her because I don't believe she would have been happier with me than she was with the Westmores." They gave her things I could never have given her: education, stability, opportunities, and they gave her love. They gave her all the love that I would have given her, but with the security and resources that made that love truly flourish. In the end, I think Catherine had the life that was meant for her. Daniel absorbed this, nodding slowly. "That's very grown-up of you," he said finally. "Most people would be angry." "Oh, I was angry," Ruth said, "for many years. But anger is its own kind of prison, Daniel. And I've spent too much of my life in prisons, some real, some of my own making. When your father found me, I was imprisoned by despair. Catherine's story helped me see that I had broken out of that prison. I had built a good life. And Catherine had built a good life too. That doesn't change the past, but it does change what the past means." That conversation seemed to settle something in Daniel. He began treating Ruth with a new kind of respect, as if he had suddenly understood that she was not just his mother figure, but a full human being with her own complex history, her own journey. The inheritance from Catherine changed Ruth's practical circumstances, but not, to her surprise, her fundamental sense of who she was or how she lived. She continued to teach school. She continued to be devoted to Thomas and the children. She donated much of Catherine's money to education initiatives and to organizations that supported women's independence, causes that Catherine herself had cared about deeply. The house in the city remained in Ruth's name, though she could not bring herself to live there. Instead, Thomas made inquiries about selling it, and when a buyer was found, Ruth made the decision to donate the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Catherine's name, designated to support young women from poor families who showed promise in mathematics and science. It seemed fitting, somehow. Catherine had made her mark on the world through her intelligence and her determination to improve things. Ruth would ensure that her daughter's legacy continued, that other young women would be given the opportunities that society had denied Ruth and Catherine both, though in different ways. 6 months after the letter had arrived, Ruth found herself pregnant again. She and Thomas had not planned it, had almost believed their family was complete with Daniel and Hope. But Ruth welcomed this new pregnancy with profound joy. She was past the darkness now, she felt. She had integrated her past into the story of her present. She had found forgiveness, both for others and for herself. The new baby was a boy. They named him Henry, after Ruth's mother's maiden family name. He was born with a shock of red hair that seemed to come from no one in particular, some recessive gene expressing itself through the generations. As Ruth held Henry for the first time, she thought about all the children she had given birth to and raised, and the ones she had not. She thought about how love operated across time and space in ways that defied simple understanding. She thought about Catherine, who had lived a full life without knowing Ruth, but who had still, in the end, loved her. She thought about her own mother, who had believed Ruth would find happiness and love. That belief had sustained Ruth through her darkest times. And now Ruth was passing that same belief on to her children. The belief that life could be good, that love was possible, that transformation was always within reach. But even as Ruth looked at her newborn son, even as she held him close and breathed in the sweet baby smell of him, she was aware that her story was still unfolding. There were still chapters to come, still mysteries waiting to be solved. Secrets had a way of multiplying, Ruth had learned.